One of the compulsory things about strata is that every strata scheme has to have insurance, but there are so many kinds of insurance around. I'm with Steve Cheepak, who's National Underwriting Manager for CHU Insurance, one of the biggest, if not the biggest, providers of strata insurance in Australia. I'm Jimmy Thompson. This is the Flat Chat Wrap. Hi Steve, how are you going?
Very good, thank you. How are
Come
you?
on in a bit. Let's hear you nice and clearly.
Excellent.
So insurance, look, it's compulsory. We've all got to have it for our strata schemes. You would be right in the middle of this. I'm just going to throw at you all the questions I get asked on the Flat Chat website.
Sure.
What's the difference between strata insurance, home and contents, and landlord insurance?
Okay, so strata insurance, the big difference between the three insurances you mentioned there is one is the insured party is the owner's corporation or body corporate for strata insurance.
That's strata insurance, yeah.
Correct. Whereas the landlords and the contents are what you call a personal line insurance. So it's in the name of the individual or individuals.
Right.
So diving into more detail on that, strata insurance is for your common areas of your unit complexes and the building overall.
Yep.
That's a very simplistic view. There's more to it than that, but that's a very simplistic view of strata. The landlords is for lot owners who rent their units out, so it gives them a level of protection for any liability within their unit.
Well, what kind of protection would that be?
Well, so if a tenant were to hurt themselves or have a personal injury claim or a material damage claim within the unit, which the lot owner could be held responsible for, perhaps they haven't maintained an appliance correctly, that covers them for that liability aspect. As well as the landlord also has protection for things not covered by strata building insurance from a property component. So things such as blinds, carpets, things like that.
So if your tenant gets blind drunk one night and walks through the glass door onto the balcony, which turns out not to be toughened glass, that would be covered by landlord insurance?
It would depend who was held responsible. So in that event, that could be the landlord held responsible if it was found they had contributed in some way, shape or form.
By being blind drunk.
Or it could be the owner's corporation.
Because it's their window, yeah.
Or because it's their window. Or alternatively, they might try to raise a case, but it might get thrown out because there was no negligence from any third party. But yes, that's what it's there for in case there is a claim which arises and there's protection in place should they be found to have some contributory negligence.
So you've got strata insurance, which is the owner's corporation gets for the whole building.
Yes.
Then you've got home and contents, which is the owner, resident owner, gets for their stuff, basically. It's for your stuff in the apartment. And then you've got landlord insurance on top of that, which is if you are an investor, if you're a landlord, you're insuring your property and you're insuring the tenants to a certain extent for being damaged by your stuff.
Let's just try to clear the delineation between those very carefully. So the landlord will have property in a unit such as carpets, light fittings, blinds, that sort of thing. It doesn't extend to protect the tenant's own contents. That's where they need their own contents policy.
You're right.
So your general unit contents are those items which you would move if you moved house.
Right.
So your tables, your televisions, your couches, things like that.
Yeah.
That's the delineation between them. So the landlord's protection is covering the landlord's property in terms of those carpets, things like that. The content is protecting the occupant's own contents, things you'd typically move when you're moving house.
Right. And then that brings us into this murky area of fixtures and fittings, which are covered in the strata insurance.
Yes, it's quite confusing. It can be quite confusing. So it's very important to try and understand the differences in cover. I'm going to use a generalization here because there's always exceptions to the rule, but some people describe strata insurance as one of two ways. One is you can turn the building upside down and shake it, and whatever doesn't move forms part of a strata insurance.
Right.
There are some exceptions.
Right.
Or some people have described it as the inner surface of the walls, ceilings and floors.
Right, but then things like kitchen cabinets, that's fixture and fittings.
Correct. So then, taking that definition a bit further, we look at permanent fixtures and fittings falling under the strata insurance policy. So whilst they're not common, they're not owned by the strata plan, they're within a unit. A permanent fixture, and again, another general way of looking at it is if you remove those permanent fixtures, it would cause considerable damage to the property. So permanently installed bench tops, bathtubs, toilets,
sinks.
You can't take that with you if you were to leave the unit and move house. Right. Well, if you did, it's going to be quite noticeable and cause a lot of damage.
One of the common sources of conflict in strata is where the owner of the apartment, maybe the shower screen is broken, they say my shower screen's got a crack in it, they go to the owners corporation and the committee says, well, that's your problem, not ours. Wrongly. There's two choices for the owner then, it seems to me. One is they can go through the rigmarole of taking the owners corporation to fair trading and NCAT and whatever, or I understand they can come straight to the insurer and say, we want to make a claim against our building's strata insurance.
That's correct. All lot owners form part of the owners corporation or body corporate, so they are an insured to the strata insurance policy. Right. So whilst the most common case is they go through their intermediary, should they have one, they can actually contact the insurance company directly.
Do you get a lot of that?
Not working in claims, I couldn't give you an estimate, but I'd say no, it doesn't happen frequently.
Because until this podcast, most people didn't know about it.
Potentially. Yeah. But they also find it easier to coordinate tradespeople through their strata managers and or brokers. Those intermediaries do have expertise to assist with the process.
So that's a preferable way to do it.
I'd say so, but not all strata owners have intermediaries either. Some go direct. So either way is fine, but at least it keeps everyone in the loop as well in terms of the process.
Yes.
There's no gaps in knowledge, and I think with anything to do with community living, the more people informed, the better. So it's advisable from that way.
I'm with Steve Cheepak from CHU, and we're talking insurance. The other big question, and I think this is causes a lot of irritation in strata. If the strata committee or the owners corporation decides to get their insurance directly, so that they're not going through an agent and they're not going through their strata manager, how come you don't discount the commissions that you would otherwise be paying to a strata manager or an agent of some sort?
Okay, it's a good question, and commission is always seen as a dirty word, regardless of whatever industry you're in. But there are some facts around this which are quite straightforward. One is the cost of doing business from an insurance perspective is lessened when intermediaries involved. And by what I mean by that is our acquisition costs would be a lot more significant if we didn't have intermediaries regularly bringing business back.
Yeah.
In terms of advertising, website development, things like that. So there is an increase in cost if intermediaries were to disappear.
Right.
The other fact is intermediaries do take on some of our workload, which we would get if they didn't exist, i.e. liaising with the clients, obtaining details of a building to get quotes, submitting claims forms, coordinating contractors. So they are actually assuming some of the workload which we would be doing from go to O if they didn't exist. So there are some of the reasons why that is the current state of play.
I guess so some of those agents, the strata managers, I mean, when it comes down to simple stuff like filling in a claims form, they know what they're doing more than an individual committee member might. That makes it easier at both ends of the transaction. Is that fair?
They tend to be set up for the process. They have computing systems in place to deal with it, so they have pro formas to use and all of those systems in place. So yes, I'd say that is correct. It tends to be a bit of a smoother process. Having said that, CHU's always been happy to deal with owners corporations however they see fit, whether that's through a broker, through a strata manager or directly. Yeah. But to answer your question, that is the reason why there is no commission refund when it's done through direct.
Right. Okay. I'm with Steve Chipak. When we come back after this short break, we're going to talk about the kind of things that would invalidate your insurance. That's after this. So, Steve, you've got your strata insurance, you've got your landlord insurance, you've got your home and contents insurance. What kind of things invalidate any of those kinds of coverage?
Okay, so when looking at a contract not being fulfilled from insurance, it really comes down to misrepresentation of a risk or fraudulent misrepresentation of a risk. And by doing that, it's the insured deliberately withholding information which is material to the insurer making a decision whether to accept the risk.
Right.
So let's explore that a bit further. If a client deliberately withheld information which would change the insurer's mind whether they would have accepted that risk or not,
right,
that is where a contract could be invalidated should it come to light in the event of a claim. So let's explore that with a practical example. Yep. So for instance, a client comes to us and says, we have a block of 4, it's all industrial units, and all of the occupancies are motor mechanics.
Right.
They're all motor mechanics.
Right.
We look at that risk, we look at all the occupancies, we look at what the building's made of, like we would for during any insurance transaction, and we decide to offer cover for that risk. It then comes to light through a claim or some other method that one of the lots was actually, I don't know, a fireworks manufacturer,
because there's a lot of them,
a gun retailer, any of those occupancies which you don't need to be an expert in insurance to realise has a higher exposure than your typical occupancies. If that was deliberately withheld to us and a claim occurred, that could render an insurance contract null and void.
Right.
But no matter what the circumstances are, it's all about that whether the information was material to the insurer's decision whether to accept insuring that building or not.
Okay, let me give you an example.
Sure.
A row of townhouses, each with a garage, and somebody has decided that they need an extra room in their house, in their townhouse. So they've moved the car out the garage, they've put some insulation inside and basically created another room out of a garage, and it's now, from their point of view, a habitable room. Would that invalidate the strata insurance, and would it invalidate presumably these things only come to light when something goes wrong, but would it invalidate the strata insurance if, say, there was a fire that emanated from that converted garage?
So we're obviously talking generally because there's always different circumstances that apply to different claims. But generally speaking, that sort of circumstance I couldn't see validating the insurance.
Even though that's a change of use from a garage to a habitable room or a games room or something like that.
Correct, because I guess if the risk came to us and was presented as a row of townhouses where a garage had been converted, would that deter the insurer from taking on that risk? Right. I would think it unlikely unless, and this is where it comes down to circumstances, they had done something drastic in that process, i.e. knocked out structural walls, so the whole structure of a building was at risk.
Right.
Had they compromised fire safety measures, things like that.
Yeah.
That's where different circumstances can come into play. But generally speaking, I couldn't see that as making the insurance contract null and void unless some of those other circumstances I mentioned came up.
Yeah, other factors in there. I mean, presumably, if they put in a kitchen and they were frying chips and there was no smoke alarm, you might think differently.
Exactly. And in the event a claim occurred, even if the contract was fulfilled, obviously, if the premises had to be rebuilt, it's going to be rebuilt to a compliant status. They're not. If whatever the alterations or additions that were made, if they were illegal or non-compliant, any of those things, they're obviously not going to be reinstated to that level.
Do you consider Airbnb and all the other short-term letting agencies, do you consider that a change of use in a residential building?
Well, that's, I don't know if difficult to answer is the correct term. The key with Airbnb or any short-term letting is it's not a decision by the owner's corporation. So given in the event of strata insurance, the owner's corporation is the insured, how can they disclose something which they may or may not even be aware of? It's a lot owner choosing to do that. Would I consider it a change in use? It's not a change in use as the dwelling, assuming it's residential, is still being used for the purposes of being a residential dwelling.
Yeah.
So it's not a change in use from that point of view. Does short-term letting increase our exposure throughout strata? You could argue yes, purely because you've got a greater volume of people coming and going to the building. So just purely by weight of numbers, there's a greater exposure. However, I don't see it as something which would null and void the insurance contract either.
What about the home and contents insurance for the individual, for the host, the Airbnb host?
Okay, so for anyone using Airbnb or similar, well, let's talk about Airbnb because I'm familiar with how their insurance structure works. They actually have two insurance programs in place to offer host protection, and that's one for within the unit and one for damage which might expand into common areas.
Yeah.
You would have to check with your landlords or contents insurer whether they do cover short-term letting. CHU's Contents and Landlords does allow it, including in terms of loss of rent benefits for any confirmed bookings for Airbnb or short-term, but that doesn't necessarily reflect through the entire industry. So it's very important if you have a landlord's or contents insurance policy that you read your policy wording and PDS to see what coverage you have in place.
I assume that the Mascot building and the Opal building, both of those buildings for different reasons, have had to evacuate residents and close down apartments, some of which we know were on Airbnb. Would your landlord insurance cover loss of income for that? You know, when there was a legitimate booking and the policyholder could come back to you and say, look, this is not my fault. I can't get this money that I would be getting, and I'm not covered by the government's very generous grants for rehousing people. Would your kind of landlord insurance cover that?
Well, it all comes down to whether the reason for the unit having to be vacated is an insurable loss.
Right.
So what is the nature of the loss which led to the unit having to be vacated? We all know that a fire and things like that are covered, and therefore that loss would be covered. Now, Mascot is obviously very prominent in the news, and I've read articles just like everyone else, but not having handled the claim, don't know the exact circumstances as to why they have vacated, apart from there's structural issues and people have vacated. So in order to access a loss of rent component, you need a claim to be admissible under Policy 1, the building insurance. In terms of our strata insurance, we have a broad form accidental damage policy, and that means that if something is not excluded under the policy, it is covered.
Right.
Why is that relevant in this case?
Yes. Good question, Steve.
So in the Mascot event, if the circumstances around the claim were excluded from the policy, then there wouldn't be cover in place for relocation or loss of rent. So not wanting to guess what the circumstances were, but what's just been reported in the media, there could be things such as lack of maintenance, erosion or earth movement, latent defects, settling, creeping of foundations, which are general exclusions under most insurance products. In the event it was something to do with that, there wouldn't be cover in place. However, if the nature of the loss was due to something which was a claim under the policy and wasn't excluded, then they'd be able to access the loss of rent benefit. But not knowing the particulars of Mascot.
No, and it changes on a daily basis.
Yes. Not being privy to the engineering reports and so on, I can't give a black and white answer on that, sorry, but hopefully I've given your listeners an understanding how a claim would be assessed.
Just briefly touching back on Airbnb, you have policies at CHU that certain policies automatically cover people for Airbnb being hosts in Airbnb. Is that correct?
Not sure I understand the question. Sorry, you're covering their capacity as a host or just them as a landlord?
As a landlord, I think it's part of your landlord insurance.
Yes. So again, for confirmed bookings, yes, it's part of a disclosure for obtaining landlord's cover. We actually ask if they have short-term stay, and if they say yes, we still offer cover. So yes, we do.
Is it a different premium?
No.
Right. So it's basically free coverage. All you have to do is...
I think it's just included as part of a basic package.
You just have to admit that you've got Airbnb in your apartment.
Yes.
What if you found out later that they weren't allowed to, like the buildings in New South Wales are allowed to have bylaws, say you can't have Airbnb, and somebody comes to you and say, I want to claim on my Airbnb insurance?
Yeah, well, I guess that's an interesting example, because that would be a material fact that, let's say, a council or any other statutory body has said that they can't have Airbnb. If they've knowingly requested cover and not provided that, I would consider that a material fact.
Right.
Does it ultimately change the risk? No. When I say does it ultimately change the risk, the fact that we allow it within our coverage, it doesn't change the risk. But if they're not complying with legislation, that is a material fact which they should be disclosing.
Right.
So my tip to owners corporations as a whole, given that short-term stay, Airbnb and similar is done at a lot owner level and not an owners corporation level, if they are aware of people breaching instructions about the permitted use of units, the owners corporation just needs to be able to demonstrate they've exercised a duty of care, and that would be by sending notifications out to all their occupants and owners, whether that's in their meeting paperwork or as a separate circular.
Yeah.
At least they've exercised a duty of care to inform them of what the rules are and what is and what isn't permitted. But they're not police at the end of the day. They can't physically stop it. They can just do their best to enforce it.
You'd be surprised. You'd be surprised.
Okay, maybe I should rephrase that as it's a long process to try and get some of these things stopped.
Yeah. Again, you'd be surprised.
This is actually separate to short-term stay in a formal sense, but I was at a cladding summit and I heard someone from the fire brigade talking about overcrowding of units and things like that. And not that this dismisses any exposure which short-term staying actually creates. He mentioned that overcrowding of units and units being used for not its intended purpose with 8 people in a 2-bedroom unit has been prominent well before short-term stay actually came to play. So it's now more of a media spotlight, but it's actually not as new an issue as some people might think. It's existed for a long time. It's just a bit more formal with companies now being set up to generate revenue from it and people involved.
You'd have to think that overcrowding in apartment buildings increases the risk of damage and catastrophic events like fires, etc. We've already seen the 2 major events in Sydney and in Victoria. It may have just been a coincidence, but they were both in apartments that were overcrowded by some definition or another. If you were to find that buildings were allowing overcrowding, would that again come back and be an insurance issue for you? And you're saying, well, you don't have the right coverage for the way you're using the building? Yeah,
it could be. If the owner's corporation is well aware that units are being overcrowded and they've not demonstrated an attempt to try and minimise that, again, there's only so much they can do. They might not even be aware of some of these things. But if they were deliberately advocating that sort of thing and encouraging it and just letting it slide, that's a potential liability exposure to the owner's corporation as a whole. You can imagine in the circumstances you've said in a fire, heaven forbid that people were injured or killed in that fire, and then it went to court and the owner's corporation, all their representatives were on the stand and they were asked, were you aware of this? And they say yes.
Yeah.
You can guess how that's going to go from a liability sense. It all comes down to a unit should be used for its intended use, and overcrowding does put people, it can put people's lives at risk just because the building is designed to be able to evacuate X amount of people if it's being used for its proper purpose. If there's 4 times the amount of people which they're expecting in every unit, things like escape through fire escapes, fire stairs, all of that, it can potentially be compromised. So it's all about using a strata dwelling for its intended purpose.
Which some people would say brings us right back to Airbnb.
Correct.
Where you get 2 people say, we want a 1-bedroom apartment for 2 people, and then 10 of their best friends turn up to party.
And that's where I come back to saying that Airbnb or short-term accommodation, purely by the fact you have more people coming and going on a more regular basis, that increases your exposure, just purely by volume of people.
Okay, well, when we come back, we're going to have a chat about the worst and the best of insurance policies in Australia. I'm with Steve Chepak, and we'll be back straight after this. So, Steve, just staying on the dark side briefly, is there such a thing as a catastrophe insurance? I mean, we've had the Opal Tower thing. And I'm not talking about insurance for the building, but I'm talking about where the owners' corporation suddenly find they've got to find accommodation for a lot of their residents. We've had, obviously, Mascot Tower recently. There was, a few years ago, there was a gas explosion in a building in Bondi, which is probably closer to your area of concern than, because these other things are structural to some extent or another. Does that get covered by strata insurance?
Well, again, I'd have to go back to my previous answer about whether the claim initially would be admissible under the policy. In answer to your question, is there a form of insurance to cover residents of buildings being relocated in the event of the circumstances you said, gas explosions or the Mascot Towers example? It would again all come down to, was the nature of the loss a claim under the policy, or was it excluded? If it's a valid claim under the policy, then they can make a claim for the loss of rent or temporary accommodation. The owners could.
And how quickly can you turn that kind of thing around? Because, I mean, at some point, forms have to be filled in and things have to be assessed. Meanwhile, people are standing out in the street or sleeping on their friends' floors if they have any friends. That's where I would be in trouble. How quickly can you turn these things around? Do you have a mechanism for immediate response, or does it just have to take its time and go through the process?
I can't speak on behalf of all insurers, but CHU has a dedicated large loss team who know how to respond in these circumstances, so the human element always comes into play. We can worry about the black and white of a policy afterwards, but in the immediate short term, there's a human element where people need to be safe and secure, and so that comes into play. And then the nature of the loss should come to play. Whilst Mascot Towers are still investigating, and as you said, reports are changing day by day, it wasn't something as clear as a fire or a significant hail claim where the roof came off, or is just straightforward, that's a claim under the policy. Yeah. So in most of these circumstances, the nature of a loss is pretty evident from the start. In these other ones, as you mentioned, it's a lot more deep diving has to go into it.
It's interesting that the government in Mascot Tower basically said you can have $200 a night for accommodation if you had a one-bedroom apartment, and I think $250 if you had two. So they've set, is that a benchmark that they got from you, or is it something that you guys would probably look at that and say, well, they've set a benchmark, they've set an expectation for this kind of thing, so that's something that you would look at in the future if it was an insurable event that you had to cover?
No, I don't think we'd be guided by that benchmark unless it was legislated we had to. In terms of our loss of rent claims, it really is based on the precedent of the existing leases in place. The information is already there if you have a signed a lease agreement in place, saying what the value is, what they're obtaining a week. So we'd be guided by that rather than just a figure plucked from thin air.
Okay. Finally, normally in our podcasts we do the crazy stories that have come up during the week on Flat Chat, but this week we're going to ask Steve about the weirdest insurance claims he's heard about.
Yes, I'm trying to make sure nothing's too topical. There was one in the past where we had, I don't even know how we ended up paying the claim, like in terms of what nature of claim, whether it was malicious damage or because it wasn't accidental damage, but it was discovered upon the releasing of a unit that all the kitchen cupboards had had the doors removed and chicken wire put in, and they had chickens, like almost a battery hen style, operation going on in the kitchen. So you can imagine the state of the kitchen and the associated odours and things like that permeating through the unit. So strata is a very unique proposition where you see a lot of different weird and wacky things from time to time. That certainly being one of the strangest claims I've ever seen come across the desk.
Well, we've had stories of somebody plugging the drain holes in their balcony and turning their balcony into a fish pond, and then claiming for the damage to their carpet. But I guess that claim would not have gone through.
Let's leave that one, as we'd have to explore that claim in a lot of detail to see the full circumstances.
Okay, well, I've been talking to Steve Chipak, and he's been very, very helpful. But this has been the Flat Chat Wrap. Thank you very much, Steve.
Thank you.
Before we go, an amazing thing has happened in the past couple of weeks. We've had the 10,000th download from this podcast series. So thanks for listening, especially if you found us recently and have gone back into the archives to look for more. If you're listening to the podcast for the first time, you can subscribe on iTunes, Spotify, or whatever podcatcher platform you use, and new episodes will be delivered to you pretty much as soon as we post them, and it's all for free. If you're not into podding, you can catch us now on YouTube as well. And of course, if you have any questions about living in strata, or just want to find out what's going on generally, go to our website, flat-chat.com.au. That's all for this week. Thanks again for listening. I'm Jimmy Thompson. Talk to you again soon.